Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Metal Art Endurance. Coach Cole here, and today we're going to talk all about running mechanics. We're going to talk about what we look at when we review a runner's gait. What are some things you can do to improve maybe your speed, to get more power out of your stride, to reduce your risk of injury, and just what should you be thinking about when you're out for a run. So first, let's think about kind of what is running. I think a more applicable way for just you as an athlete is to think about running as a series of jumps, and specifically jumping from one foot to the next. So because running is jumping, we have to think about what is jumping. And when we coach jumping, we were really coaching what we call triple extension. So to understand the difference between flexion and extension in anatomy is that flexion is when we decrease the angle of a joint, and extension is when we increase the angle of a joint. So you can think of triple extension as happening across three different joints, which is why it's triple extension. We have extension at the hip, at the knee, and then again at the ankle. So we would begin, this is an example of somebody performing a clean. So they begin with a flexed hip, a somewhat flexed knee, and then a relatively neutral ankle. And what happens is the angle at the hip starts to grow, the angle at the knee starts to grow, the angle at the foot, right towards the end, they get into what we call plantar flexion, which is when you push your toes away from you. And then we end up with a fully extended hip, knee, and ankle at the top. And that's what we coach when we coach jumping. So running is jumping, but we are just trying to move forward. So we apply this triple extension motion just at an angle, so we hopefully propel ourselves forward. So this is a video I put together in my undergrad. I did not do any of this research, or my screen went all crazy there. I did not do any of this research. This is a video of a runner from Western University. This is some data from the journal Biomechanics. You can find the article here if you want to look it up. What I did is I applied these green and red lines so that they sync up with the green and red kind of leg and arm that is happening here. So but really what we're looking for is we can kind of pause him on this green leg right there. So we're getting into hip extension. We're getting into knee extension. And this runner here is a really good example of how taking a really simple video of yourself, slowing it down, even pausing it, can give us some insight, can really put us down a path of maybe how we could train somebody to get some a more efficient stride, because he's doing a really good job of extending at the hip and at the knee, but his ankle is still relatively neutral. So this leads me to think, could we get him maybe more mobile, or maybe get some more strength in that area so he would be able to get more plantar flexion when he toes off? So the next thing we need to think about is just kind of some basic physics so that we can understand some of the injury prevention methods, really, and also how we can get more power out of our stride. And the main piece of physics we're going to go over is Newton's third law, which is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So this is how jumping works when you propel yourself through space. With every footstep you land, you push into the earth pushes back against you, and that is what launches you forward. That force coming from the earth, we call that ground reaction force. Now, the important thing to think about here is that the angle, or the direction at which you push into the earth, determines the angle the earth pushes back against you. So if you land with your foot very far extended out ahead of you, and your foot is moving away from you when you land, you are braking. That is what's happening. You are pushing into the earth. This way, away from myself, the earth is pushing back against me. What I want is for the earth either for me to land with a really perpendicular shin and me to push directly down. At least then the earth is pushing me up and my momentum can carry me forward. Or ideally, I land with that same perpendicular shin and my foot is actually moving back towards me. So now I'm pushing backwards into the earth and the earth will push me forwards. The way at which we distribute this ground reaction force, the way we interact with the ground, really determines a lot of, or almost the entirety of, your power and also your risk of injury. So there are three methods we use to kind of distribute the force and to kind of help get more power out of the stride. The first thing to consider is just foot placement. Now, cushion running shoes are a thing that are a relatively new invention. They're definitely not the devil, and there are a lot of folks who will say that heel striking is very, very bad. I will say that there doesn't seem to be in the research much of a difference in prevalence of injury between heel strikers and midfoot strikers. Where there is a difference is where those injuries tend to present. So a midfoot striker, someone who's landing more towards the ball of their foot, is going to see more lower leg injuries. Generally, somebody who heel strikes, they negate some of the natural shock absorbers lower in the leg, so the arch, the ability to kind of load into your Achilles as much. We tend to see the force distribute higher into the system, more into the knees and into the hips, and that's where we tend to see more injuries. And if we look at gait retraining research in a clinical sense, putting somebody on a treadmill and reinforcing movement patterns, a strategy we see athletes use is actually to just adopt a midfoot strike, even if that's not the cue that they're given. So it does seem to be potentially a good mechanism, especially if we're trying to reduce, say, like incidence of knee or hip pain. So for this reason, I tend to lean more towards a midfoot strike. At first, getting a more midfoot strike feels a bit unnatural. And so I do this activity, and it's really the sense of going down a set of stairs. That if you were to go down a set of stairs, you would instinctively, naturally, you would land on the ball of your foot, and as your body travels over top of your foot, your heel will come down and you'll reach a stance phase. You'll reach a place of full balance where your foot will be fully connected to the floor, and then you continue to transition, then your next foot lands. So it's ball of the foot. As you come over, your heel comes down, and then we fully balance. So the activity is we get people to go down a set of stairs, and then once they reach the bottom of the set of stairs, they try to continue that same foot movement. So this is a thing you can try if you want to feel what a midfoot strike feels like, and then once we can memorize that feeling, we can start to apply it to our running. And now we can look at this runner again, and we can start to look at what is happening with his foot right before or when he makes contact with the ground. And what we see is that he's extending, and then right here, that's pretty much initial contact. And if we see, it's a pretty perpendicular shin angle, so he is not too outstretched. His shin is nice and perpendicular to the floor. We'd want about a 90-degree angle here. And it's important to note that his foot is just ahead of his center of gravity. That only really in like top speed sprinting or mainly in acceleration would we see the foot be like directly under or behind the center of gravity. You're not going to land with your foot directly underneath you. That's okay. But there's generally kind of an acceptable margin we would want to see. But really it's the angle of the shin which starts to become important. And when we look at it in motion, is this foot coming back towards his center of gravity right before he lands? This is one thing we want to see. And another really easy thing, you can take a video of yourself, slow it down, and you can see this. You don't need all these lines in order to see that. You can just see a nice slow video. Does your foot travel out, or does it travel back towards you when you first make contact? And this all becomes really important when we think about just how high impact jumping is. Now, I touched on this in the last video, but before we allow athletes to do plyometric training or jump training, we want to see you can do one back squat with 150% of your body weight on your back, that you could do 5 reps of a back squat at 60% your body weight and do that in 5 seconds. So it's pretty quick. That's 1 squat every second. And the last is we'd want to see 30 to 60 seconds of balance in either a quarter or a half squat, which again is pretty challenging. And this is because the volume of ground reaction force, kind of the intensity of that ground reaction force, can be about 2.5 times your body weight, that we have to distribute that again through the system, and that's all coming up through one leg. If we go back to the example I used in the last video of a new runner going out for a half-hour run at 160 steps per minute, that's just about 5,000 steps, so it's a lot of reps. And then my next thought is, if we were to take a sample of runners and run them through these 3 tests, I would say the majority would fail on number 1 and number 2. So that would be quite challenging for a lot of runners. So if a lot of runners who are some of the most plyometric athletes that we have would fail the pre-test for plyometric training, then how exactly are they not all injured? And I mean, the answer to that question is a lot of them are. That running injuries are very, very common. That's one of the reasons I do what I do, to help people hopefully stay more injury resistant. That's kind of always the goal. So the second way that we help to mitigate this ground reaction force, or this is even a way that we actually help to use it to help us move forward, is that we use something called the stretch shortening cycle. And this is really that we're loading into the elastic component of your muscle. That when we look at drawings of muscles, it's often like a big chunk of red muscle, and then at the end there is a white tendon that attaches to the bone. And this gives us the idea that it's muscle and then tendon, and that they're totally separate things. But when we look at an actual cadaver, you can see fascia wraps around the muscle, goes all through the muscle, that there's connective properties all through the muscle. And when we stretch that elastic component of the muscle, we get some free energy. You can kind of do some tests for these 3 examples I have on the screen. So the first would be, let's try just jumping onto your couch. But you can even just jump up and down on the ground as well, but you would probably do this instinctively, where you would load into the squat a little bit and then jump up. And that is loading that elastic energy. Again, we get both the power of the muscle and the elastic return. But if we sit too long in that stretched phase, we lose some of that elastic energy. So the second test you can do is try sitting down into that exact same quarter or half squat position that you were in, and sit there for 3 or 5 seconds, and then try to jump up. And you'll find it's much harder. You have to use a lot more muscle in order to get up to the same height. You might not even be able to get up to the same height. And the last one is that if a muscle isn't pre-stretched, we just can't get that elastic return at all. And where this really comes into play, and you'll notice this when we go through all the phases of the running stride later, is that each phase stretches the muscle that is going to power the subsequent phase. So as our leg travels back behind us, we stretch our hip flexors, which then power the next phase by driving our knee forwards. This is really trying to harness the stretch shortening cycle so that we can, again, use the ground reaction force to help actually power us forward. The next way that we distribute force is by trying to use what we would call the spinal engine. 2 different concepts here. One is that we want this reciprocal rotation. Your shoulder comes forward as your opposite hip comes forward. This is the connection between opposite arm and opposite leg. Rotation in running, it isn't bad. And it in fact gives us some insight as to why, for runners, we would want to program core exercises differently than the core exercises we would use for, say, powerlifting or Olympic lifting, because in those sports, having a rigid core and bracing is like the name of the game, so that you can be safe while you're throwing huge amounts of weight around. In running, we want rotation. We want a controlled rotation. Obviously, we want to bring things towards the midline generally, and generally we don't want them to cross the midline. And what this reciprocal rotation allows us to do is to distribute force from the lower half of the body up into the upper body and then back again. And this is what we call kind of the elastic support mechanism. So we can come back to this video now and we can look at, okay, what is the rotation like for this runner here? And we can see, we'll start at the shoulders. You can see opposite arm, opposite leg are obviously in sync, that there is rotation at the shoulder, and that there's a little less rotation at the hip. I would say there's still some, like here. So here we can see his right glute, and then now his left glute obscures his right glute. So I would say that that is an example, or that is kind of proving that there's some rotation happening at the hip here, and that's what we want to see. Maybe runners who are new or who come from a more kind of powerlifting sport, or if you're being taught to run as like a maybe in football, you want to be rigid and braced because you're expecting a hit. That we would maybe see a more kind of blocked up, more rigid torso, and then teaching people to rotate properly and to develop strength from that is, again, kind of points us down the road of how can we make somebody more efficient in running. And so there are 2 fundamental core exercises we use to strengthen and to teach this idea of rotation, and they target what we call the anterior and posterior oblique slings. It's essentially a connection. In the first one with the bird dog, we're teaching a connection between one side your lat through your rotator cuff, down across the back and into the opposite side glute. And as we're contracting this right shoulder into the left glute here, we're also stretching across hip flexor into across the core up to the chest and shoulders on the right side again. So one side contracts, the other side of the sling on the opposite side of the body, it stretches. The reciprocal motion to this is dead bug. And this is kind of, these 2 are the go-to core exercises I use with runners in place of planking. Because again, planking is much more about having a rigid core and reducing rotation, but in running, we want to have a controlled and strong rotation. So now we've gone over how we distribute force while we're running. We can go over all the phases of the running gait, and it's important to know that there is no actual first step in the running gait. This is always kind of happening in a cycle, and the opposite leg is happening. We're going to talk about one leg at a time. The place we're going to start is what we call mid-stance, which is where your foot is directly underneath your body. This is kind of your point of greatest balance. we could say. The name of this phase, this is what I call it, is takeoff. So this is where we're moving from mid-stance until your toe just leaves the ground. In each of these phases, we will load elastic energy into the muscle and we will contract a muscle somewhere else. So what we're doing here is we're using the strength of our quadriceps, partially, mainly our glutes and our calves, to get fully extended into that triple extension motion. And in getting into triple extension, we stretch our hip flexors and our hamstrings. And then in the next phase, we are now, our toe has left the ground, you're now a projectile. We've stretched into that hip flexor, and now what our hip flexor is going to do is it's going to contract to drive our knee forward, and our hamstrings work to curl our heel up towards our butt. And this is important because the length of your leg is important, because we can think about kind of levers, another kind of physics thing. This act of curling your heel up towards your butt is what we call heel recovery. So another thought experiment we can do to kind of prove the power of levers is think about holding 10 pounds in your hand and just lifting it up to your shoulder. Now you can think about that same 10 pounds extended out ahead of you. You have to lift it up with a straight arm. Becomes significantly harder. Now if you put that same 10 pounds at the end of a sledgehammer and you were to hold the whole thing out and you're really displaced it as far away from the joint as you can, you try to lift it up, it becomes very, very hard. And this is because the further weight is away from a joint, the more force the muscles of that joint have to produce. So same concepts apply to your foot and to your leg. And so if we curl your heel up towards your butt, we shorten the lever of your leg. This means your hip flexors don't have to work as hard, and we can move forward with less energy. And again, we can come back to our runner. So once he is extended, so let's go right leg here. So he is extended here. We've stretched hip flexors. Our hamstrings are, they're starting to get stretched. Our knee's getting pretty straight. And as he comes forward, his knee drives forward. But as he's driving this knee forward, his heel is coming up towards his butt. And his heel is coming up actually pretty good. If you were to Google the Olympic 10,000 meter, you would see that with every stride, their heel's coming up essentially all the way to the butt. And that's even in like a 27-minute race, right? So like a relatively long race. They're still coming all the way up. Generally for like recreational runners, we want to see like at least a parallel shin. That's kind of, at least some of the research have seen says that that's relatively ideal. But this lack of heel recovery is one thing that I notice with new or slower or kind of more senior runners, is that they start to lose heel recovery. Or ultra runners are really notorious for this. They get into the ultra shuffle where their feet barely leave the ground. And the other thing that happens is, again, that knee moves forward, and this is about mid-swing here. The knee is ahead of the body when the heel is kind of closest to the butt. If you follow any of my other content, you'll see the step-through exercise used often as like a banded exercise or sometimes just with body weight, but it's really to teach the connection of these first two motions, from toe off, extend, and then drive the knee forward as we curl the heel up towards the butt. So that's something you can check out, and I'll probably make some more videos on that in the future as well. And this thing to go over is just a simple drill we use to, again, teach better heel recovery. So we can watch this video here. And this is what we would call a C, or a butt kick. Okay, I finally got to pause in the right spot. So what we'll notice is that as we're doing this butt kick, as the heel is coming up towards the butt, the time it's highest, our knee is 10, 15 degrees flexed. And I don't know why gym teachers teach butt kicks like this, but our knee is not directly underneath our body when we're doing butt kicks. That is not how we coach it for running, at least. If you want to do these as a running specific exercise, we want to allow this slight bit of flexion at the hip while we're doing heel recovery. Okay, phase 3 of the running stride. So now we've come into mid-swing. Our foot, again, is underneath our body. This time it's off the ground. And now what's going to happen is our glutes have actually contracted to slow down the momentum of our leg. Our quads are going to contract to extend our knee, again, lengthening that lever and slowing down the momentum of the leg. And what that's going to do, as we extend the knee, that's going to stretch into our hamstrings, and we're going to do one of the most important motions of running, which is paw back. So this whole phase, you could almost divide this one into two phases, because we step through, our knee extends, and then right as we get almost to like a straight leg. We bring our foot back underneath our center of gravity, and we can go back to Newton's third law. Again, what we want is to land with our foot traveling back towards us and with that relatively perpendicular shin angle. The way that we coach this is with a drill which we call bees, and this is often the most challenging drill for people to learn. It takes quite a bit of practice. Often we'll just do this as a standing exercise to start, but what you're doing is you're loading up into the top of this kind of high knee position, and we're extending the knee and pawing it back. Oh man. And we're pawing it back towards our body. Okay, so now we've pawed back, our foot has made contact with the ground, and now we are in the last phase, and this is going to be from initial contact back to that mid stance. And this is if you go to a podorthist office to get an orthotic, or you go to visit a physiotherapist, or you were to come in to see me at the clinic. This is probably where we would spend most of our time paying attention to, because this is the phase where you really kind of where your body decides how it's going to distribute all the ground reaction force. It's between making contact and getting into mid stance. This is where we'll see things like overpronation is a very common thing. Maybe knee valgus, that inward collapse of the knee, contralateral hip drops. You land on one leg, and that whatever leg you're standing on will jut out to the side, and the other hip will just drop down. Might be weakness in the hips and the core. So we would look for these indicators, and they generally tend to happen in this stability phase. The good thing is that this stability phase can be very easily trained, and doing a lot of kind of single leg balance exercises, memorizing the positions of quarter squat. There's lots of things we can do in the strength and conditioning world to really make you more stable in this position. And the other thing that's important to notice is a lot of these things aren't evil. That pronation tends to get a very bad rap, but pronation is a very natural thing. We want your foot to pronate a little bit. We want your ankle to flex, and we want your knee to flex, and we want you to flex a little bit. We don't want you to flex too much. We don't want you to pronate too much. We want everything to be within control. There's a balance that we want to see. It's important just to be kind to yourself, and no one's going to have perfect running form, but we can try to just do the best that you can. And now we could really start to think about kind of all these factors that we've gone over, and how do we start putting this together. And kind of the initial skill that we need is what we call proprioception, or body awareness. It's that ability to feel your body in space. And this is why I start with what we call A's. And these three drills we've gone over are the A's, B's, and C's of running. And although A is in itself a fantastic just posture drill, really the way I use it is to teach body awareness. As we take this relatively simple high knee march, and all of a sudden we start to be like, okay, I really want you to try to feel the coordination between opposite arm, opposite leg, or what angle is your pelvis at, or where are you placing your foot, or how are you swinging your arms? And then can we think of all 5 or 6 of these factors together, and then learn body awareness? And once we get that skill in a march, then we can apply it to your running. Because the main thing that's going to make you better at running, or if you want to make an improvement to your form, is you have to think about the improvement you want to make. You have to know what it is. That's the most important thing. And if you can be reminded of it often enough and just attempt to change it frequently enough throughout the week and throughout a single run, that those changes will happen over time. But you first have to have the skill of being able to feel and kind of actually alter your movement pattern. So we would start with the A march here, which I will get to play. It's just a very simple high knee. Again, trying to bring that foot back underneath the body, trying to get opposite arm, opposite leg coordinated, get a little bit of rotation through the shoulders. I'm probably a little stiff here through the shoulders, but we would use this to coach body awareness. That's the goal. So now, I would be remiss if I did a video about running form and I didn't touch on kind of cadence and stride length. And this is what a lot of people will focus on, because there's very good research that if you just up your cadence by 8 to 10%, that this can actually mitigate a lot of injuries, at least if your cadence is low. And there's often this magic number of kind of 180 steps that's thrown around, and that is the average cadence for runners. But there is a huge variety, and what I tend to aim for most of my runners is to try to get this would be people in what we would consider like maybe a normal height. But so if you're taller, your cadence is naturally going to be a bit slower, and if you're shorter, your cadence is going to be a bit higher. But we would tend to aim in this 165 to 175 strides, and that would be for easy running. and that if you're running faster, that we would want to see, if we can hit this minimum of 175 steps, and then you might end up well over 200 steps a minute, especially if you're full out sprinting. But really, it's the influence of speed and height that they have to be considered whenever we're looking at cadence. And then stride length, really all of the things we've gone over earlier are contributing to your stride length. That's more so what we're focusing on when we're trying to get more power out of your strides. So any of the other tips I've gone over, especially kind of heel recovery, would be one that will help with stride length. But what's important to know is if you want to get faster, you have to increase either your cadence or the length of your stride. You have to do one, or often what happens is we end up doing both. Okay, so all of the stuff we've gone over, let's see, you've taken a video, you've identified one or two things that maybe you want to change, or you sent a video to me and I've given you some tips. How are we going to actually apply this to running? So we would do this with strides, which are these kind of 50 to 200 meter accelerations. We'd work up to a pretty quick pace, hold that pace, and we're trying to do this without getting into a real, a grind. We're trying to avoid grind. We're trying to have very focused running, kind of the fastest running you can do with the least amount of effort. This is, it sounds like it's really hard to do because it is. To learn any new movement pattern, you have to start with intentional practice. And then with practice, we can eventually not have to focus on it so much, and we would say that you've reached kind of mastery of a motion when you no longer have to hyper focus on it, when you can just kind of get into a flow state would be ideal, but we can get into a state where you can kind of let your mind wander and your body just instinctively goes through it. Okay, holy moly, another very long video. Thanks so much for making it all the way through to the end. If you did, I would love to start doing some video analysis on here and going over these factors. So if you think you could benefit from that, send a video. You can reach out through the website or through Gmail, as long as you're comfortable with your footage being put up on YouTube. As always, do the YouTube things, like and subscribe. You can leave me a comment below. I love hearing from y'all. And get out, go for a run, and stay punk in everything you do. Sweet.